Very good morning to all of you. I hope you're well and I hope you're safe. Today, I'd like us to have a look at Psalm 77. Psalm 77, so if you could turn there, thank you. One of the most helpful and precious things about the book of Psalms, and the reason that I read the book so often when I'm in trouble, is that the psalmist tells us things as they are. The psalmists don't pretend to be super saints who never have problems with sins. They know they're sinners and they talk about their struggles with sin. The psalmists don't pretend to understand God or to understand everything he does. They give expression to their bewilderment about God and his often strange ways. The psalmists never pretend that life is easy and painless. They constantly record the pain of their battles as they try and get through life. Now, one such psalm in which pain and bewilderment and struggles of life are honestly and openly spoken about is Psalm 77. The exact situation in which the psalmist and the nation of Israel found themselves in when this psalm was written is not known. But what is known, however, is that this man and his people were battling very difficult, painful, and protracted circumstances. As we chart the course of this battle, as it were, what emerges from the psalm is that correctly interpreting the past brings consolation in the present. Correctly interpreting the past brings consolation in the present. The first part of the psalm is a record of the psalmist's experience of distress, his experience of distress. In other words, what he went through emotionally during this time of painful circumstance. And three distinct aspects of his experience are recorded here. Number one, we have the plea of the sufferer. The plea of the sufferer. In verse 1 we read, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. The picture is clear. Whatever was going on, whatever trouble had overtaken this man, the first thing he does is to cry out to God. Now, in all probability, he did so out aloud. He probably called out, O Lord, hear me and help me. And we know that Jesus did exactly the same thing on the cross. He calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me? This crying out to God is probably the experience of many of us as we face this pandemic and we face the handling of it, or the lack thereof, by our government. We have every reason in the present to frequently cry out to God. Now, realistically and bewilderingly, and particularly when it comes to protracted problems, it often happens that when we cry out to God, our cries echo, as it were, off the ceiling. The words don't seem to be making their way through to God. They only bounce back to us, or so it seems. And I'm quite sure that all of us have had that experience. Number two here, the psalmist speaks of persistence of the anguish. The persistence of the anguish. In verse 2, he says, when I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night I stretched out my untiring hands, and my soul refused to be comforted. Now we can just see that, can't we? This man is literally stretching out his hands to God, night after night after night, and not receiving any consolation. The problem, whatever its cause, just will not go away. And as a result, this man goes on and on suffering and crying out to God. Now here, we as 21st century Christians have a real problem and dilemma, particularly when it comes to this global pandemic or something equally terrible. In our world, you see, we have come to expect instant solutions to all of our problems. And so we are bewildered, for example, that we don't have a vaccine available nearly 9 months after the beginning of this pandemic. And equally, we are angered that we are effectively still locked down after a seemingly absurd length of time. And, dare I say it, we as Christians may be crying out to God that He apparently hasn't heard our crying out. He should have answered our prayers by now, we think. Our problem, it seems, is that we have yet to come to terms with the fact that some situations allowed by God cannot be instantly sorted out. Some circumstances allowed by God have not changed because we, His children, have yet to grasp exactly what God is trying to teach us as His children. Such a severe and global calamity allowed by God and to be continued for such a protracted time should alert us as His children that God is trying to teach us something all the while we are crying out to Him. And all the while we are crying out to God and He doesn't seem to be paying the slightest bit of notice. Number 3, the psalmist records the pain of the memories. The pain of the memories. In verse 3, he said, I remembered you, O God, and I groaned. I mused, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. As the psalmist feels the pain and anguish of his circumstances, and as that pain and anguish go on, day in and day out, he begins to remember a time when things were different. And those memories just make things worse. He remembers God and how God once seemed so close, and he groans. He remembers the days gone by before the calamity even hit him, and he probably wishes that he was living back in those times. He remembers his songs in the night, and those songs which he found so easy to sing because life at the time was good and it was so easy to praise God. Perhaps he yearns for circumstances to return to normal so that he could sing like that again. Now, those sort of memories plague us too when we go through rough times. We remember, for example, that it wasn't that long ago when we felt financially secure, but that is not the case anymore. We remember that we had jobs and so we could budget for a particular lifestyle. We remember that we had freedom to hop into our cars and go and visit our children or our parents or shop as we wished. We all remember better days. We were younger, we were more mobile, we were fitter, and we had so much to look forward to. However, and just to bring some balance here, I wonder whether when we consider what we have lost, whether we were grateful enough to God for His provision at the time that we had it. And I also wonder whether we were aware that so many people in our country had no jobs in the first place and struggled to feed their families so that they hardly hearken back to the good old days. Certainly times are tougher in the present, but the good old days were not good old days at all. So the lesson which the psalmist teaches us here, apart from the ones which we should be learning now, is that any occurrence of protracted pain will probably give rise to similar feelings and experiences. We cry out to God, who doesn't seem to hear. We continue to cry out to God, who still doesn't seem to hear us. And then we remember when things were different. Remembering better days just seems to make matters worse. Unfortunately, that isn't all we go through during times of distress. And the second part of this psalm records the psalmist's bewilderment in distress. His bewilderment in distress. Not only did this psalmist feel pain, both spiritual and emotional and perhaps physical, but he also had his mind tormenting him. Specifically, the psalmist is faced, number one, with an apparent rejection by God. An apparent rejection by God. In the second half of verse 6, he says, "My heart mused and my spirit inquired, will the Lord reject us forever? Will he never show his favor again?" In the middle of all of the psalmist's emotional turmoil, he muses. That is, he goes through things in his mind and is even more devastated. And that because it looks like God has rejected him. The word reject there means to strongly dislike or disapprove of. So he's thinking, hey, does the Lord now so dislike me? Does the Lord now so disapprove of me that I am forever separated from his love? The word favor, on the other hand, means to delight in or accept an individual. So he's thinking to himself, hey, is there nothing that I can do about God not accepting me anymore? Now, I don't know about you, but when I get to thinking in a tough situation that actually the Lord doesn't like me very much, when I don't like myself particularly much to start with, and that actually the Lord no longer accepts me and there is nothing I can do about it, then I am in a really, really bad place. To seriously feel and believe that fills me with sick dread. What could be worse? God doesn't like me and God doesn't want me back. Now, just before we all lose our faith, let's remind ourselves that such feelings will probably come to us during tough and painful times. We don't generally feel this way when things are going well. However, and this is absolutely vital, those thoughts and those feelings are ultimately just not true. They are only our experience and our evaluation. They are not God's feelings and God's evaluation. And that's proved when the psalmist is faced, number two, with an apparent change within God. An apparent change within God. As the psalmist works through his emotional and cognitive trauma, he gets to thinking the unthinkable, and that is that somehow God has changed. And so in verse 8 he says, has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion?